Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
The land down under has never been easier to reach. United Airlines has more flights between the U.S. and Australia than any other U.S. airline, so you can fly nonstop to destinations like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Explore dazzling cities, savor the very best of Aussie cuisine, and get up close and personal with the wildlife. Who doesn't want to hold a koala? Go to united.com/Australia to book your adventure.
Long, long ago in Australia, there lived a frog named Tiktaalik. One morning, Tiktaalik woke up and was really thirsty. So, he decided to drink all the water. Yep, all of it. One frog. Soon, as you might imagine, every plant and animal on Earth started to suffer, and many started to die. It was a very serious situation. So serious that a group of surviving animals got together and devised a plan to get this frog to release the water. Their idea? Make him laugh. So they picked an animal. Let's say a kangaroo, because that would be funny. They picked this kangaroo. They workshopped some frog humor, and when you know it, Tiktaalik began howling with laughter. But, too much too soon, and a global flood ensued that wiped out all living things. The ancient Iranian god Harzu of Zoroastrianism, one day, long ago, warned a young man named Yima, the fourth Shah of a once powerful dynasty, that a harsh winter, the worst in history, was about to befall the land, and that when the snow melted, well, things are going to get crazy. So here's what Harzu said needed to happen. Yima, find a few of the fittest men and a few of the fittest women you can find, along with 2 of every animal, plant, and bird in the world. Build a really big boat and gather all the food you can before the snow comes. Because the global flood caused by the snow melt will, you guessed it, kill everything on the planet and wipe out all traces of civilization. High in the Andes Mountains of South America, long, long ago, lived the Incan creator deity Viracocha. Viracocha's first stab at populating the earth was a race of giants, but they were a little too tough to keep under control. They were always making problems, they wouldn't listen to Dad. So, Viracocha sent a mighty flood that not only killed all the giants, but turned them to stone. He then created a more civilized race that was less troublesome. Us humans. You see where I'm going with this? Nearly every culture on every continent has a creation myth that proclaims that a global flood wiped out everything that came before it. I say nearly because, for unknown reasons, Japan doesn't have a flood myth, and there are a few others, one notable other that we'll get to in a minute. It's interesting that all these cultures, most of which had no contact with any other culture in the ancient world, would share such similar myths about the destruction of a civilization that became unruly or arrogant or selfish, to the point that the gods needed to intervene in a way that was, by any fair reading, psychotic and way over the top. Just kill everyone. The flood myth in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh predates the Old Testament by more than 1,000 years, and the Quran by even longer. The Australian myth about the thirsty frog is an Aboriginal songline that has supposedly existed for more than 10,000 years. And the first inhabitants of North America, tribes from coast to coast, have flood myths dating back as far as the Aboriginal Australians do. The Chickasaw Nation version has the Great Spirit Abba bin Li'i send rain enough to flood the entire planet. The Chickasaws built rafts to save themselves, but then large white beavers chewed the reeds that bound the rafts, and everyone and everything drowned, except for one fortunate family, along with a pair of every creature on earth. When the flood waters receded, a raven appeared with an ear of corn and told the survivors to plant it. Thusly, the world was repopulated, and the gift of agriculture was bestowed upon humanity. So going back for a moment to the last episode, part 1 of this Atlantis story, what Plato wrote about in that dialogue between Socrates and Critias was ostensibly a flood myth. The only problem with that is historically, Egypt, like Japan, doesn't have a culture-spanning flood myth. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The annual flooding of the Nile is seen as a blessing that allows for the fertile soil that produces the food that feeds the population of the Nile Valley. Floodwaters are not inherently destructive to the Egyptians. So what were these priests talking about regarding the destruction of Atlantis? Basically, just an isolated incident that wiped out a specific part of the known planet and, importantly, didn't affect Egypt. We'll come back to all this in a minute. For now, we need to discuss one of the many, many violent and destructive epochs in the history of our planet to get a better understanding of why, for all the differences in culture, language, location, and beliefs, so many of these flood myths, these tales of destruction, and the disappearance of Atlantis, why they have one thing in common: the date of approximately 12,000 years ago. Around 12,800 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, began a geologic period called the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas represents a rather sudden deep freeze, followed by a gradual warming event for approximately 500 years, followed by a near vertical spike in global temperatures for an additional 300 years. The glacial tundra of Scandinavia is the habitat of a plant called Dryas octopetala, an evergreen dwarf shrub that thrives in cold conditions and became abundant during the sudden deep freeze at the start of the Younger Dryas, and completely disappeared during the even more sudden warming spike approximately 800 years later. An earlier geologic period of glacial conditions is called, you guessed it, the Older Dryas. But what caused the Younger Dryas? And critically for our story, was there an advanced human civilization before all the craziness happened? First of all, the Ice Age probably isn't as bad as you're imagining. For me, at least, I thought it meant that the globe was one giant ice cube. But no, in fact, during the last Ice Age, only about half the continent of, say, North America was covered by ice sheets. Imagine Tennessee, Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, right around that latitude from coast to coast. Above that lay millions of square miles of ice up to 2 miles thick. But below that, hey, party time. So at least in terms of survivable climate, humans could have been doing more than just hunter-gatherer stuff 12,000 years ago. Since the discovery of the Younger Dryas, the most prominent belief was that it was caused by a massive slowdown or even complete collapse of what's known as the North Atlantic Conveyor, basically a current in the Atlantic Ocean that circulates warm, tropical water northward. A deep freeze occurred for a few hundred years, but then what unlocked all of that frozen water? What could have melted and released all those thousands of square miles of ice and produced a catastrophic flood? Well, the most current theory is rather controversial and not without a chorus of very loud detractors. But to be fair, there are some now universally accepted scientific theories that were at first widely discredited. So let's pump the hate brakes for a minute and remember where science comes from. One of the pillars of the scientific method is that a theory has to be falsifiable. There needs to be a scenario which, if discovered, would prove the whole thing wrong. For example, If someone found a complete modern human skeleton fossilized beside a T-Rex, well, then we could probably throw evolution out the window. But that hasn't happened, so evolution's a thing. In the early 1900s, the first ideas about continental drift first started circulating and were shot down by the old school. Even though every elementary school kid who ever looked at a world map could understand that South America and Africa were at one time connected, it needed to be proven. So, falsifiable scenarios were thought up. Unless you can find the exact same rock on both shores, which are now thousands of miles apart, this wouldn't make sense. Aha! Not only was the same rock discovered, the same fossils were discovered. But that wasn't enough for these stuffy science types. They needed more. Well, if continents are floating around on a molten layer of rock beneath the Earth's crust, and if above the surface of the ocean we can see that continents are moving away from each other, there should also be massive chasms created along the ocean floor where the edges of the plates are moving away from or colliding with each other. Okay, boom, found it. Kinda everywhere in the Pacific. Okay, good enough. By the 1960s, plate tectonics was accepted as a massive geological phenomenon and taught as settled science. But not every emerging scientific theory has an obvious smoking gun, like continents that fit together like puzzle pieces. Sometimes it's the small stuff that proves a big theory. Enter the Alvarez hypothesis. In 1980, physicist and Nobel laureate Louis Alvarez, along with his geologist son Walter, made a discovery that would redefine the history of our planet. A generation earlier, in 1953, there were a few geologists that had the gall to suggest that it might have been an asteroid impact that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. But without any real evidence, they were probably laughed out of the, symposium. What else, they wondered, could leave behind the evidence they found for global floods, firestorms, and a massive extinction event? But without evidence or a falsifiable scenario, nice idea, but no one cared. Then along comes Louis Alvarez and his son Walter. When they first suggested that the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period was also caused by an asteroid, they were roundly dismissed. But then they asked, but what if we can prove it? How? Well, by the 1980s, geology had advanced to the point where you could study the layers of sediment and rock around the globe like you can study the rings on a tree, and just about as accurately. So have you ever seen a tree that's been cut down, and you can clearly tell that years prior it had survived a fire? You can see a charred ring in the lifespan of the tree rings. Very similar with the geologic record of our planet. Alvarez proposed that if indeed a massive asteroid slammed into Earth, there would definitely be a record of it preserved in ancient sediment layers, just waiting to be discovered and read like a book. And he was right. At exactly the boundary separating the Cretaceous and Paleocene periods, there was a unique layer of sediment that contained levels of the element iridium that was hundreds of times above normal. And what did that mean? Well, for some reason, a whole bunch of iridium was suddenly in the atmosphere and settled on the surface of the entire planet, but only for a short period of time, around 66 million years ago. Now, iridium is one of the least abundant elements on Earth. It's 10 times less abundant than platinum and 40 times less abundant than gold. And where does iridium come from? Well, like other heavy elements, the only place in the universe where it gets hot enough and violent enough to actually form iridium is in the belly of an exploding star. So, it soon became clear to the Alvarezes, and soon to the global scientific community, that what happened was a supernova blasted a whole bunch of heavy elements, including iridium, across the galaxy. And some of it became the stuff that formed into an asteroid that was bumped into a path that put it onto a collision course with Earth. It crashed into the relatively shallow water of the Gulf of Mexico and exploded with the force of billions of atomic bombs. it wiped out 75% of all living things on the planet, including the dinosaurs. When the dust literally settled, a layer of iridium-rich sediment blanketed the globe. And over the course of millions of years, it was slowly covered with layer upon layer of sediment that would one day in the distant future tell the story of a terrifying cataclysm. All that was needed was the right mind to be able to decipher the clues. That mind turned out to belong to Luis Alvarez. Okay, you've all heard me talk about Factor before. Factor is a company that delivers meals ready to heat and eat that are obviously delicious, nutritious, and easy. But here's how Factor has seriously made my life better. So we all have certain days of the week that always seem to just get away from us, right? For me, it's Tuesdays and Thursdays. I go from the studio to picking up the kids right into driving them to their separate athletic events. By the end of the day, I was always irritable because I didn't have time to eat. When I started ordering meals from Factor, all that changed. Just those 2 days being more manageable made a huge difference in my life. Because they're 2-minute meals. No shopping, no prep time, no cleanup. They have breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack options. Keto, calorie conscious, protein heavy, smoothies, you name it, they have it. Factor Heat and Eat meals are the perfect option if you need fast, premium meals that are less expensive than takeout. Seriously, they did the math. It's less expensive. So sign up and save. Head to factormeals.com/devilwithin50 and use code devilwithin50 to get 50% off. That's code devilwithin50 at factormeals.com/devilwithin50 to get 50% off. All of this is to say that, like plate tectonics or the Alvarez hypothesis, the Younger Dryas impact theory, which states that around 12,000 years ago, the Earth was bombarded by multiple comets and asteroid impacts that struck at several places around the globe and effectively melted the polar ice cap that caused a global flood that affected every known culture on the planet and led to the flood myths that span cultures and continents for thousands of years. Although this theory is not accepted by mainstream science yet, it could one day be the best explanation for these myths that are as much a part of the human story as evolution itself. Or maybe it won't. That's what's great about science. Smart people are trying to figure stuff out and they're not scared to be wrong, because more than anything, they're after what's true. So as far as Atlantis is concerned, the book Mysteries of the Unknown led us to believe that the best understanding of the day pointed to the island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea as the most likely location as it relates to Plato's dialogues. However, in the more than 30 years since it was first published, there's a new leader in the clubhouse. And it's pretty insane to consider. Okay, quick. Where's Mauritania? I'll give you 5 seconds. 3, 2. I admit I got it confused with Mauritius, the island nation off the coast of Madagascar, because my buddy went there on his honeymoon. But I had no idea where Mauritania was. Then I looked at a map, and it's a huge place in northwest Africa. In the early 20th century, it was colonized as part of French West Africa before achieving independence in 1960. But here's the kicker. More than 3/4 of Mauritania is desert, comprising a huge chunk of the Western Sahara. As you move closer to the coastline, there's everything from savanna to rainforest, but the deeper inland you go, it's all sand dunes, north into Algeria and Morocco, and east into Mali. But along the way, amidst those sand dunes and rock salt, you might just come across the lost city of Atlantis. Deep in the Western Sahara Desert, amidst a large outcropping of ancient bedrock, lies a nearly 30-mile-wide circular structure consisting of concentric rings separated by deep valleys with a round island directly in the center. I know, right? Sounds a lot like Plato's description of Atlantis. That is, of course, if we go with the idea that he misplaced a decimal point. And to be fair, that is, of course, if we go with the idea that he misplaced a decimal point. And to be fair, I'm not using the word structure in a disingenuous way. The actual name of this place is the Richat structure, better known to Atlantis hunters as the Eye of the Sahara. The Richat structure is really wondrous to behold, breathtaking, really. It was first described by geologists in the 1930s and determined to be the result of what's called a laccolithic uplift. That's what happens when a vertical chute of molten lava hits a weak spot in between two layers of strata in the Earth's crust and pushes one layer upward while spreading out on the lower layer, forcing them apart. It forms what's called an inclusive rock dome on the surface. Science says that's what happened here millions of years ago, and over time, the rock that made up most of the dome structure eroded, leaving only what amounts to the foundational rings behind. That's why it's called a structure and is no way meant to imply that it's man-made. But if you think about it in a way slightly outside of scientific understanding, well, then we can have some fun. You see, despite there being tons of physical evidence that the Richat structure is purely a naturally occurring geologic phenomenon, there is also tons of circumstantial evidence that it's the capital city of a lost continent. As mentioned, the layout of the structure is eerily similar to what Plato described, and it's not just the rings of water separated by rings of land with a circular island in the center. Plato also described a southern entry point that connected to the sea. If you look at an overhead view of the Eye of the Sahara, there is, in fact, what appears to be an opening of the surrounding rock that could have, at some earlier time, been an access canal to the Atlantic Ocean. Plato also described large squares of flat land on either side of the city. Again, if you see the area from above, there are clearly large swaths of land on either side. But maybe the most compelling piece of evidence to consider is the fact that both within and surrounding the Richat structure are massive deposits of salt. So much that the area is known for salt. Harvesting, transporting, and selling salt is a big part of the desert economy. Where did all this surface salt come from? Yes, surface salt. Again, by observing the structure from above, you can see large patches of white in the concentric rings that signify the lowest parts of the eye. Logic would tell us that's where salt water evaporated long ago. But it's not just logic. There's also hard evidence that lets us know that this area was once surrounded by water. Archaeologists have found tons of mollusk fossils, creatures that live in the ocean, and they've been carbon dated to between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, right smack in the time frame Plato gave for the existence of Atlantis. Again, this is all really fun to think about, and so many new theories have been put forth since the first volume of Mysteries of the Unknown was published that we probably need another book dedicated just to this new area of scholarship. But there's one more cool development that was discovered in just the past year. Of the many things that could be said about the Romans when it comes to building a powerful empire, military techniques, representative government, roads, they were also terrific map makers. They'd have to be, given the sheer size of their empire. You'd need to know how to get places. And the safest, quickest, and cheapest way to get places is with accurate maps. Well, a Roman map was recently discovered that included almost the entirety of the African continent. After it was restored and steps taken to preserve this archaeological gem, historians were given the opportunity to study it. The detail was fantastic, and the accuracy, as one would expect from the Romans, was incredibly precise. What surprised those studying the map was an interesting location, clearly marked in present-day Mauritania, right on the edge of the Western Sahara Desert. A city the Romans called Atlantis. Thanks for listening to The Devil Within. We'll be back next week with more episodes, so make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You could also check us out on social media at The Devil Within Pod on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.